Interview. Taking stock. An interview with George Habash. Souedi. How old were you when you left Lida? Were you politically aware from an early age? Habash. I was in elementary school during the Great Rebellion of 1936–39, and I still vividly recall the anti-British demonstrations and strikes organized by the Palestinian nationalists and slogans like "Down with colonialism" and "Down with the Balfour Declaration." The principal of our school, Tawfiq Abu al-Souedi, was an ardent nationalist. I remember once when a fight broke out in a corridor among the younger students, he chastised them, saying, "Instead of fighting among yourselves, fight Jews." Another day our arithmetic teacher asked us to stand and observe a minute of silence. I had no idea what it was about, and I don't think anyone else did either. When the minute was up, the teacher said, "At this very moment, our young men are going to the gallows for fighting for their homeland." I was greatly moved by that incident. So I was a nationalist then in a broad sense, but I had no thought of a political career. When I was 13, just after finishing elementary school, my family moved from Lida to Jaffa. I enrolled in the Greek Orthodox school there, but since it wasn't a full secondary school, after the second year I transferred to Terra Sancta II in Jerusalem. After I graduated, I returned to Jaffa and worked as a teacher for 2 years. I used to spend my spare time at the Orthodox Club, reading Egyptian magazines, particularly articles on literary and cultural topics. In 1944, I went to Bayou-LT where I enrolled in the American University. Souedi. Was it at AUB American University of Beirut that you became involved in politics? Habash. I was immersed in my studies then but was deeply affected by certain landmark events. The 1947 UN Partition Resolution, for example. It was difficult to conceive of my homeland divided. And when Palestinians began to be driven out in 1948, I started wondering, since the Arab world is large and great, how can it be defeated by a handful of gangs? Then, at the beginning of my second year of medical school, a classmate named Mahmoud al-Asmar, who came from Nablus, told me about closed seminars of 20 to 25 students being organized by Professor Constantine Zurek III, who was talking about Arab nationalism, the Arab nation, and the need for a renaissance. I began to attend. Mahmoud also wanted us to meet with an AUB alumnus named Ramez Shiadeh to discuss how to George Habash, founder of the Arab Nationalist Movement and Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. LPS Beirut Archive, Achieve Arab Unity and Save Palestine. But by that time, I was determined to return to Lida, so the meeting never took place. Souedi, you returned to Lida during the 1948 war to Habash. It was June 1948. The academic year was over, and the university was closed. By that time, the Zionist forces had expelled the population of Jaffa, and the exodus from Palestine was at its peak. Many had fled to Lida. 3. Born in Damascus in 1909, Zurek was a leading historian and exponent of secular Pan-Arabianism. His monograph on 1948, The Meaning of the Disaster, had a strong impact on Arab intellectuals, including my parents. They were fairly well off. My father had a store, you could call him a merchant, and they had sent me money, wanting me to stay in Beirut. My mother was always worrying about me. So they were very surprised when I showed up in Lida. They didn't believe I could be of any use under the circumstances. I thought about it. Could I fight? Since I had already started to study medicine, I thought I could be of service in this area. There was a doctor at Lida Hospital, from the Zalan family. I began to serve as Dr. Mustafa Zalan's assistant. Souedi. What was the situation in Lida like at the time? Habash, there was an extraordinary anxiety, like in the other towns and villages that hadn't yet fallen to the Jews. Air raids had the population terrorized, and the town was overflowing with refugees from the surrounding areas that had been attacked by the Zionist gangs. The Lida branch of the Arab Higher Committee headed by Haj Amin al-Husseini urged people to stay put and even tried to prevent them from leaving. Some took comfort from the presence of an Arab Legion force near Lida, thinking it would save the city when the Jewish forces launched their massive assault. 5 Soued, where were you at the time of the attack? Habash, I was at the hospital, helping Dr. Zalan. The place was overflowing with dead and wounded, and the situation was quite terrifying. I was totally occupied when my mother's maternal aunt came to the hospital looking for me. She wanted me to return home, saying my mother was worried about me. Of course I refused. Finally she had to tell me that my sister had been killed, my older sister whom I loved dearly. He pauses to control himself. As I ished through the streets, there was great confusion. Dead and wounded, some of whom I knew, were strewn along the side of the road. We buried my sister near our house because we could not get to the cemetery. 3 hours later, Jewish fighters stormed the house, screaming, "Out! Out! Get out!" My mother and my sister's children, including a small child we had to carry, ran out, as did other relatives and neighbors. We had no idea where to go, but the Jewish soldiers ordered us to get moving. So we walked. It was a hot day in Ramadan. Some people around us were saying it was the day of judgment, others said we were already in hell. When we reached the outskirts of town, we found a Jewish checkpoint where those leaving were being searched. We had no weapons. But our neighbor's son, Amin Hanhan, apparently had some money concealed on him and wouldn't let them search him. A Zionist soldier shot him dead right in front of our eyes. His mother and sister rushed to him, wailing. His brother, Bishara, had been in elementary school with me and we were friends. We used to study and play together. Again he is overcome with emotion. You wonder why I have chosen this road, why I became an Arab nationalist. This is what Zionism is about. After all this, they talk about peace. This was the Zionism that I knew, that I saw with my own eyes. Soued. What happened to your family? Habash, we went to Ramnallah. My family then moved on to Amman, and I went back to Beirut to continue my medical studies. Soued. What about your remaining years at AUB? Which of your fellow students do you remember? Habash, Hani al-Hindi 6 Wadi Haddad 7 Ahmed al-Khatib 8 Saleh Shaival, Hamd al-Jabari, among many others. 9 We were part of a student political movement with members in all of Lebanon. Soued. Were you thinking then of some undertaking beyond student activities? Habash, of course. With Wadi Haddad, Ahmed al-Khatib, and Hani al-Hindi, we were attracted by the idea of direct action, fast and effective action. We were young at the time. Hani al-Hindi told us about individuals in Syria who thought the way we did. That is how the Kataib al-Fida al-Arabi Arab Commando Battalions was born. I and Hani and Jihad Da'i-10 and Hussein Tawfiq from Egypt and others were active in the Kataib al-Fida al-Arabi. Our primary targets were first traders, then the British, and finally Israel. However, following the abortive attempt to assassinate Shishakli 11, which was carried out by Hussein Tawfiq, possibly at the behest of other parties, without my approval or that of Hani and Jihad, it occurred to me that it was unreasonable to expect to liberate Palestine through such tactics and that it was time to start thinking of launching a political movement. Guided by what Hani and I had been reading at the time, the idea crystallized in our minds that it was not possible to liberate Palestine without first achieving Arab unity. The organization we had in mind could be run only by determined men who would forsake their personal careers and dedicate themselves to the cause. Thus the nucleus of ANM began to form. Of course, a very broad Arab nationalist rend already existed. What characterized the ANM was the belief that the liberation of Palestine required Arab unity. We believed that the movement had to be very tight-knit. Soued. Was there an ideological basis for the core group? Habash, it was the thought of Zurayk, who had written about the Nakba, and Safi al-Husari 12, known then as the father of Arab nationalism. Once, when Husari was asked why we lost in 1948, he replied, because we were 7 states. But of course, reading Zurich and Husserl was not enough. When we began to think of organizing a political movement, we realized that we had to read everything. We determined that we would not allow ourselves to form a movement until we were convinced that we had a political vision, in keeping with what we understood political vision to be at the time, and an iron organization, which had to be proven in action, not through words. Regarding ideology, Marxism had not yet come into the picture for us. We had a negative attitude toward it because of the Soviet Union's support of partition. In any case, we made an intense effort to learn and did an enormous amount of reading. With Hani and Wadi Haddad, we read a lot of history, about the German and Italian unification movements and the French Revolution and so on. I also studied the Quran. So did Wadi. I still have a vivid mental image of Wadi and Hani, immersed in their reading. We insisted first on being honest with ourselves. It wasn't until 3 years from the time we began thinking about it that we announced the formation of the organization. We began to organize in 1951. I went to Imam, and Wadi followed me there 13, and later it occurred to us that we had to make the movement our full-time occupation and that no sacrifice would be too great. When Ahmed Khatib, who had gone to Kuwait, collected his first paycheck of 100 dinars, he sent us 90 dinars. We said, now we can begin. Souedi. If you were to organize the Arab nationalist movement all over again, what would you do the same and what would you change? Habash. I would introduce democracy as a basic motto, starting in the family and at school, in clubs and associations, all the way to democracy in political activities, organizations, parties, and state institutions. Thus, in addition to recovering Palestine, I would add the issue of democracy. I also used to understand ulity in terms of the paradigm case of the total and instantaneous loan between Egypt and Syria, without adequate preparation under Nasser in 1958. Now I understand it differently. We must first consider the issue of complementarity and see unity as a cumulative process to be completed in stages, step by step, consolidating achievements conclusive to unity in the economic, social, or cultural realms. I see it now as being achieved in successive stages of rapprochement ADC in regional ulits, the Maghreb states, for example, the countries of the Fertile Crescent, Egypt and Sudan, the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. Moves among leaders in one region whether or not similar progress is made in others. Eventually, there could be a federation among the regional units modeled on the United States. In the meantime, at the pan-Arab level, there should be freedom of movement for individuals, the promotion of intra-Arab trickle, coordination among Arab universities, and certain civil measures. We would be embarking on a long and interlinked process. Then there is the issue of socialism. At the beginning, socialism was not on our agenda. Our motto was unity, liberation, and revenge for what happened in Palestine. Socialism was incorporated later as a result of give and take within the party. I want to emphasize that my principal ideas were formed in response to real events determining my line of thinking. Redenelli and party debates played a role, but if you are asking about the principal influence on George Habash's thinking, the answer would have to be events: the breakup of the UAR in 1961, the 1967 war, the 1973 war, the Intifada. First, events occur, then the debates about what happened led, dini what Onel reads even else, interactions, read in G in that order. Souedi, can go back to the topic of socialism? Habash. As I said, socialism was not part of our agenda at the beginning, even though we knew that the masses were the basis for everything. In that sense, we were progressive. Then we issued a very important circular outlining the stages in which socialism had to be realized. That was the first step toward greater democracy with regard to the movement's ideology. In those days we were still able to evolve without creating splits within the movement. Had that state of affairs continued, the ANM would not have broken down. The fact that Nasser was advocating socialism at the time of the union with Syria gave rise to a debate within the party. In early 1959, we set up a cultural committee in Beirut headed by Muhsin Ibrahim 14 with Muhammad al-Zayyat, Joseph Mughazal 15, Abd al-Hamid Sharaf 16 and Ahmed Stadiya as members. Following a discussion between the ENM's command and the cultural committee, it was decided to incorporate socialism in the agenda and to replace the term revenge with recovering Palestine. Thus the ENM's motto became Unity, Liberation, Socialism, and Recovering Palestine. The latter change was based on a recommendation of the Cultural Committee, which argued that the formulation revenge was not popular. The committee also advised differentiating between Jews and Zionists. Souedi. You said earlier that it was the breakup of the UAR that led to greater depth in your socialist thinking and drove you to Marxism. Habash, the breakup of the Union opened my eyes, forcing me to look into the forces that had brought it about. I gained a deeper understanding of class struggle, coming to realize the extent to which it was a factor in our society. I also drew lessons from Vietnam. I see no contradiction between being an Arab nationalist and being a true socialist. But my real commitment to Marxism came after the 1967 war. My Marxism grew deeper during my imprisonment in Syria. I am indebted to my jailer, Abd al-Karim al-Yundi, who kept me in solitary confinement for 9 or 10 months, thinking he would break me. I spent that entire period reading all the collected works of Marx and Engels, of Lenin, also of Ho Chi Minh and Mao. It was after that that I wrote the Declaration of the Popular Front's Second National Convention. Souedi. How do you see relations between the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, and Fatah now with regard to armed struggle? Habash, armed struggle was a common denominator between us and Fatah until Abu Amr Yasser Arafat caved in and signed the Oslo Agreement. But we always differed on major issues. For example, we always stressed the interdependence of the Palestinian and Arab nationalist dimensions, that the liberation of Palestine cannot be achieved without this interdependence. Fatah's grave error, its fatal error, was to disengage the Palestinian cause from the Arab nationalist cause. Second is the class dimension. When the bourgeoisie achieves its class objectives, it ceases to fight. What happened was that a certain class fraction, represented now by the Oslo team, believes it has scored an achievement. But what of the masses? What about their interests? Look at what has become of the masses. The corruption and co-optation of the Palestinian masses by Fatah constitutes a calamity that boggles the mind. Those same masses that had survived all the wars and the attempts to marginalize and defeat them, that had withstood the Zionist military machine inside and outside the occupied territories, are now, after 30 years, despairing and despondent under their bourgeois leadership, due to the undermining of their nationalist achievements and institutions and the stifling of democracy by the repressive state apparatuses. Mafias are on the rise, and connections with the occupying power are being exploited to secure monopolies on daily necessities. Still, although I lay the basic blame for the current state of affairs on the Palestinian Authority team, I do not exempt the opposition, which has not risen to the challenge or been true to its declared objectives and programs. As for armed struggle, the PFLP advocated it until the Intifada. Under armed struggle, it is the Fadayin who fight, but under the Intifada, it is all the Palestinian people, children, women, artists, everybody. With the Intifada, I felt for the first time that it was possible to achieve freedom and independence in some part of Palestine. I know now that there were those who turned armed struggle into a sacred right. We've gone beyond this notion now and see armed struggle as part of the wider political battle. Whether or not one adopts armed struggle is determined not by matters of conscience but by the nature and practices of the enemy. It is also determined by the objectives of the Palestinian people, objectives that cannot be achieved by diplomatic action alone but that require a comprehensive struggle in which revolutionary violence, in its various manifestations, has a special place. There is no contradiction between this and other forms of struggle, such as the political, cultural, and economic. But the Oslo Agreement squandered the achievements of the Intifada in the occupied homeland, just as it squandered the achievements of the armed struggle phase. In fact, putting an end to the Intifada was one of Israel's basic conditions for agreeing to the Oslo Accord. Souedi. But by the time the PLO started negotiating, the Intifada was already in its death throes. Habash. Abu Amr began making concessions even before that time, at the Algiers conference. This is what caused Israel to demand further concessions. He went to negotiate under the worst possible conditions from the Palestinian, Arab, and international perspectives. Souedi, the PFLP has been criticized for hijackings and hostage-taking. What would you say about this matter in terms of ideology and procedures? Habash. Starting in the 1960s, there was a lot of concern about Israel's nuclear capability. I remember discussing the issue with Nasir. We used to have an advisory board consisting of Palestinian professors and other friends, and they thought we should draw world attention to the nuclear issue. Meanwhile, Wadi and I were trying to determine how world opinion could be awakened to the injustice that has been done to the Palestinian people. Wadi came up with the hijacking idea, but he repeatedly used to instruct those carrying out the operations not to hurt anyone in any way. We wanted to attract world attention through some action, and that was it. Souedi. Do you think that kidnapping civilians has won supporters for the Palestinian cause? Even if one were a supporter of the Palestinian cause, surely such an ordeal would have a negative effect on one's sympathies. Habash, we put an end to those operations in 1972. But looking at the 3-year period when we carried them out, we have to conclude that they did have an impact. We have to evaluate the opera, we have to evaluate the actions in a wider perspective than the bitter personal operations, in a wider experience of the individual passengers, and our perspective than the bitter evaluation was that these operations made the world personal experience of the aware of our people's suffering. Individual passengers. As for the operations against Israeli civilians, one opinion was that all Israelis are settlers and usurpers. I am one of those who subscribes to this view. Nevertheless, we focused on the military. I agree that there should be an ethical dimension to the struggle, but it is significant that the heated condemnations usually come from Israel's supporters. If you add up all the civilian victims of Zionist state terrorism among the Palestinians, Lebanese, and other Arabs, you will see that the number is tens of times greater than the Israeli civilians killed. Souedi. What is your opinion of suicide bombings and random bombings? Habash. As a front, our view is that any action that undermines the cohesiveness of the occupation is beneficial to our cause and our struggle. Of course, our objective is not to harm civilians. Struggle for us is not an act of vandalism but a means to regain our usurped rights. The enemy's refusal to acknowledge these rights, and its recourse to the most brutal means to avoid it, is responsible not only for what has happened to the Palestinians but also for what may happen to Israelis. To those who would like me to condemn those operations, I say, why should I? I am not the party who bears the responsibility. I wish to affirm Israel's responsibility. One must go back to the roots of the issue and determine responsibility at the source. Souedi. What lessons can be drawn from the resistance's ordeals in Jordan and Lebanon? Habash. Armed struggle came about as the natural consequence of the 1967 defeat. It was a popular and organized reaction to the loss of homeland and new forcible exile and occupation at a time when the remnants of other colonial ventures elsewhere in the world were being dismantled. The Jordanian army had collapsed in the 1967 war, and the United States quickly put it back together again as a counter-revolutionary force. There soon arose a situation in which the resistance was caught between a strong Israeli army on the one hand and the Jordanian army on the other. The Jordanian army could not be said to be an enemy like Israel, but still, it was a regular army caught in a confrontation with revolutionary forces. The resistance found itself in a very difficult situation, though I believe it could have been saved if a real national unity, in the full sense of the term, had been established, If the Palestinian masses had been mobilized, and if an alliance with the Jordanian masses as represented by pan-Arab tendencies inside Jordan had been forged. What happened was that Fatah totally neglected the pan-Arab Jordanian elements. Then there is the question of possible military alliances with neighboring Arab states. There was an Iraqi army unit in Jordan, and the Syrian army was next door. But there was no comprehensive Palestinian vision of the situation. Perhaps the Palestinian left was in a better situation than it thought, but it was not up to the task. I don't want to minimize the unjustifiable errors of conduct of the resistance in Jordan. We committed grave errors in February, June, and September 1970, but other faults were fabricated in order to heighten popular divisions and to feed the resentment against the resistance in order to justify a strong attack against it later. Souedi. Would it have been different if there had been a nationalist regime-armed army in Jordan? Habash. It is true that coexistence between two authorities over the same territory is difficult. Still, one can imagine a situation where a nationalist regime would seek to understand the demands and objectives of the revolution and, without relinquishing its own authority, permit it to build a base for itself. For this, of course, it would be necessary to organize the relationship between the two and define the scope of the authority of each. Souedi, during the war in Lebanon, which was not purely a civil war, one could say that the country was used as a battleground, and that Lebanon was destroyed without any sense of responsibility on the Arabs' part for what happened. Have you at the PFLP reflected on this in reviewing the events in Lebanon? Habash, it is very painful to think about what happened to Lebanon, and it is our duty to reflect deeply and responsibly on the lessons to be learned from the struggles fought there. As far as the PFLP is concerned, the situation in Lebanon was a quasi-permanent topic for discussion at our conferences and at the meetings of our command organizations. In Lebanon, one lost all sight of what was essential, and everything was buried under the rubble of instinctive reactions, sectarian, political, and regional. When relations are allowed to sink to that level of moral and intellectual depravity, one wrongs oneself first and then the others. That is why we issued an important release entitled Lebanon's Palestinians and the Choice of a Historical Reconciliation, internally and with others, that focused on this ambiguity, i.e., the basic point that the dignity and interests of the Lebanese are part and parcel of the dignity and interests of the Palestinians, and vice versa. The moral and creative bases of unity rest on the acknowledgement of diversity and individual differences, which have no real meaning outside the framework of unity. In turn, unity has no legitimacy except insofar as it takes diversity and individuality into account, the various forms of which are basic constituent elements of the public pan-Arab self. Without this regulator, individual differences become a constant source of destructive internal struggles and hemorrhaging, just as the public self in turn becomes a repressive force which seeks to impose a stultifying sameness. This is how the dynamics stifling freedom and democracy are constantly regenerated. Souedi. If the Lebanese National Movement, LNM, had been in control, would that have made any difference in the course of events? Habash, I am not sure the results would have been very different, because I am aware of the weaknesses and the serious defects afflicting the LNM at the time. Its objectives were noble and just, but there was a lack of clarity in its socio-political agenda and a weakness in its organizational structure. In fact, the LNM was unable to put forward a program and a vision that transcended the existing crisis. It continued to be reactive, which is why it could not get beyond the dominant culture in its political, social, and organizational practices. The Lebanese formula was held in place by both political and social forces. The confessional mentality and culture in Lebanon were so deeply entrenched and so widespread that only a very strong and mature political movement could bring about serious change. That was why the LNM was always dependent upon outside forces. That is how the Palestinian right in Lebanon managed to exercise hegemony over the decisions of the LNM, depriving it of a vital condition of independence and forcing on it the right's own failed and narrow strategies. For in fact, in exploiting the LNM, the Palestinian rightist trend fell into the same fatal trap in Lebanon that it did in Jordan. Our point of view at the PFLP was that we had to take a constant hard line toward Israel and to give unlimited support to the LNM and its progressive democratic plans. That is why we constantly stressed that the leadership should be totally in the hands of the LNM, which of course had to formulate a clear perspective on the confrontation with the Zionist enemy alongside its socio-political vision of the solution to the dilemmas of Lebanon. Souedi. What, in your opinion, is the secret of the success of Hezbollah? How does that differ from the experience of the Palestinian resistance in Lebanon? Habash, there are four basic elements. In the first place, Hezbollah is operating on its own territory, amidst its own people. Secondly, there is the secrecy that surrounds its military apparatus and leadership, its refusal to adopt fixed positions, and its brilliant use of maneuver for strategic and tactical purposes. Thirdly, Hezbollah has a unified leadership, and in the fourth place, Hezbollah has benefited from our experiences, both positive and negative, so that it has not fallen into the same errors that we did. Hezbollah is the crowning achievement of our bitter and bloody experiences. Souedi. Do you believe that the Battle of Beirut in 1982 affected the course of subsequent events? Did it help launch the Intifada, for example? Habash. There is no doubt that while armed struggle was being waged outside Palestine, the masses inside could rest content that the revolution was continuing. When that external horizon was closed off and it became clear that the revolution outside Palestine had reached an impasse, the Intifada began. So the Intifada cannot be isolated from the Lebanon war. At the Palestinian and Arab levels, two trends became apparent, one proposing to go on with the Intifada, the other saying that we were at the end of the road and should take up the political option so as to secure some of the fruits of 20 years of struggle. But that meant not capitalizing on the benefits of seasoned experience, forsaking our cumulative achievements, and cutting ourselves off from what we had lived through, tragically placing our hopes on what the enemy would give us. In the final days of the Lebanese war, Abu Amr had come to see me at the PFLP office at the headquarters of Al-Hadaf, our official organ. He asked to speak to me in private. He asked me, "What do you say to us leaving together?" I asked, "Where to?" He said Tunis or Cyprus. I understood what he was thinking. I told him, "If you think that the revolution is over, I don't share your opinion. The revolution must go on, even under very difficult circumstances. We must stay, and safeguard national unity and our ties with the only power capable of supporting us now, Syria." He left after that, but I did not leave with him. It was clear which path he wanted to take. The Lebanon war did play a role in that. Souedi, would you consider the establishment of a Palestinian state in most of the West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its capital, to be an acceptable solution? Habash, first of all, we are not anywhere near such an outcome. Even if the Labour Party were to come back to power in Israel, there would still be the issues of Jerusalem, the settlements, the right of return, borders, and water resources. If an acceptable interim solution becomes available, we should tell our masses, this is an interim solution, not the end of the matter. Souedi. Are you of the opinion that the Palestinian cause was better off before Oslo than it is now? Habash. Even a quick review of the results achieved shows that we lost a great deal more than we gained in Oslo. Conversely, Israel gained much more than it lost. Our losses are net gains for Israel. This is a reflection of the impasse to which Oslo has led us and of the Palestinians' difficult circumstances in our occupied homeland and the diaspora. We should have hung on to our international legitimacy, coordinated our position with the Arab countries. We should have allied ourselves with Syria, put our house in order, and continued to resist in all the ways open to us. Souedi. Would you agree to a dialogue with the forces in Israeli society that recognize the national rights of the Palestinian people? Do you think it useful to work with those forces? Habash, from a tactical perspective, we should exploit any divisions within Israel that exist. We should bear in mind, however, that the forces in Israel that advocate Palestinian rights are extremely marginal and have not played an effective role so far. In fact, they are often used by those who wish to create a compliant Palestinian mentality, offering a public relations position that wins Palestinian concessions, which in turn are paraded before Israeli public opinion as proof of Israeli good intentions. In our view, divisions within Israel will not become serious unless there is a solid Palestinian Arab front capable of forcing Israel to come to grips with the difficult questions it likes to avoid. Souedi, what is your assessment of the Arab situation today? Habash, these are the darkest days of the Palestinian cause. When I review the events of 1936, 1948, the 50s, the 60s, when I review the events 70s, I find the current period to be the worst. Of 1936, 1948, the 50s, why? Because the worst thing you can do is to serve 60s, the 70s, I render. As long as you are fighting to regain your dig, find the current period to 90, which has been debased, and your occupied be the worst land, then things are well. I believe that regimes, and some parties or forces, are capable of surrender. However, the Arab people, although they may retreat or lie dormant for a while, will ultimately not accept that their land be occupied and their rights usurped indefinitely. There are positive developments in Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, even in the Maghreb. When I meet youth from various Arab countries, I can sense the extent of their commitment to the nationalist cause. Souedi, what would you do about the situation that has emerged since the Gulf War? Habash. Concerning what happened in the Gulf, I am of course against one Arab country occupying another. We said so clearly at the time, as it has always been our conviction that the road to unity must be a democratic one. Unity is a matter of free choice, not violence. One cannot resort to arbitrary methods, or coercion, to overcome cultural effects and the economic, political, and social realities that over time have resulted in our division into separate states. One has to work toward unity gradually and on a long-term basis. The question is how to remedy the negative results of the war. We have to concern ourselves with Arab solidarity. For example, 3 Arab countries, Libya, Sudan, and Iraq, are under an embargo by the United States. The entire Arab nation must struggle to put an end to it. The opposing alliance's determination to persevere in its hostile actions against the Arab nation doubles whenever it sees an increase in weakness and divisiveness in the Arab world. If the Arabs were to undertake some kind of challenge, I don't mean war, but at least a serious economic confrontation or media campaign, they would improve their position vis-a-vis the enemy and gain some respect among nations. Souedi, how do you envisage relations with the Islamic forces that have become active in many Arab countries? Habash. This is one of the greatest dilemmas facing the Arab national liberation movement, at the pan-Arab level and within each country. To begin with, one cannot take an arbitrary decision concerning whether or not to cooperate with the forces of Islam, putting them all in the same basket, as it were. Second, one feels an obligation to deal with them because these forces are indigenous to their societies, except for some movements or groups with dubious connections. This means that we and the forces of political Islam should find a common denominator that would permit us to work together under the current and foreseeable circumstances. However, we need to differentiate between the Islamic forces that are truly engaged in the struggle on the basis of their perspectives on society and their ideology, as is the case with Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine, and the Jama'ah Islamiyah in Jordan, and those forces and groups whose acts are no longer either comprehensible or justifiable on the human, ethical, or Islamic dimensions, as is the case now in Algeria and Egypt. We believe that our relations with Islamic forces of the first type should be characterized by a deep alliance in the struggle with the enemy of our nation to bring about a showdown. The condition for such an alliance should be that joint action should be undertaken on a democratic basis. Souedi, the issue of minorities is becoming increasingly sensitive. For instance, there are those who maintain that the Copts in Egypt are a minority with the right to a special status. Some Lebanese Maronites maintain that Lebanon contains two communities differing in culture and civilization and that each has the right to organize the lives of its members as it sees fit. Habash, we must be careful not to confuse things. There is a huge difference between national minorities with distinct languages, cultures, and identities and religious or confessional minorities. It is categorically unacceptable to deal with Arab Christians as though they were not part of the social and cultural fabric of the Arab nation. Quite simply, they are indigenous Arabs, and their religious beliefs have no bearing on their national and cultural identity. Can we ever forget the contribution of Christian Arab intellectuals in Lebanon to the renaissance of the Arabic language and Arab culture? Their roots, history, civilization, and culture are Arab, and they must conduct themselves in conformity with that fact. This requires two conditions. First, the Arab Muslim majority must be acutely aware of this fact. Historically, Islam has been successful in instituting the principle of diversity and freedom of religious belief, and consequently the majority should deal in a democratic fashion with all citizens on the basis of full equality and freedom of belief for individuals and confessional communities. The second point is that religious minorities should be cognizant of the fact that they are an authentic part of the Arab nation and behave accordingly. Whether they be Muslim or Christian, Sunni or Shiite, Coptic, Maronite, Syriac, or Orthodox, they have a duty to hold on to their national identity. Souedi, what is your position now on a Palestinian state? Habash. I am in favor of a Palestinian state at this stage. And I do consider this to be an issue to be realized in stages, because I want all of Palestine. All of it? Souedi, Palestine as a democratic state with equal rights for all? Habash, yes. Souedi, what is your view of the proper relationship between Arabism and Islam? Habash, as I see it, Arabism is an outline for national reconstruction at a fixed point in time and space. This implies motion, evolution. I want to convey a sense of the Arab world's current state of fragmentation and of the stumbling progress of national liberation, and to inject an awareness of the designs of colonialism and the reality of cultural distortion. Islam is first and foremost a religion. But for Islam, religion is more than just articles of faith, rites, and rituals, seeing as Islam has transcended the concept of religion alone and gone on to a more comprehensive and deeper level. Islam is a constituent of the culture, civilization, identity, and heritage of this nation. In this sense, it is one of the basic components, if not the most basic one, of Arab nationalism. Similarly, one can say that the culture of a Christian Arab is Islam. One must try to be definite about the overlap, bearing in mind that there is interaction between the concepts of Arabism and Islam. One can speak of Islam in Pakistan without bringing Arabism into the picture, but one cannot speak of Islam in the Arab homeland in isolation from Arabism. Nor can one speak of Arabism in isolation from the Islamic spirit, culture, and civilization at its heart. In this sense, one cannot separate the frame from the picture. Souedi, what is your current view of terrorism? Habash. It really pains me that Israel, which was founded on terrorism, is now being so sanctimonious about terrorism. Why am I here rather than in Lydda? Because I was expelled through the use of terrorism. Syria has made a very reasonable proposal. It has called for an international conference to define what is meant by terrorism, which is being used today to get at national liberation movements. Souedi, how would you evaluate the course you have followed? Where have you erred and where have you been right? What is your agenda for today and tomorrow? Habash, at each of its conferences, the PFLP reviews the course it has taken since the last conference and sorts out the errors it has made. Since I was Secretary General of the Front, I had a role in these errors. You can say that these errors are my errors. They are the errors of the PFLP, but they are my errors too. You could therefore say that I have admitted to all the errors that have been committed by the Front to the present. However, when I think about your question, it seems to me that we are reviewing the course of the Palestinian problem over the last 100 years. These are not the errors of this person or that, they are the mistakes of all the Arabs, and they represent our collective defeat. Of course, we have to consider the exogenous factors that contributed to our defeat. However, what is more important is to engage in self-examination and to correct the problems facing the forces that give people hope for victory. Here, I fear that we have not used our brains as we should have. We first fought relying on our muscles, then our hearts, because our cause was just. We did not use our brains as we should have. We called for Arab unity, yet if you were to review copies of the Al-Rai bulletin we used to publish in Damascus, you would see that the Arab nationalist movement called for unity but did not say how it was to be achieved or identify what obstacles had to be overcome. The same applies to Palestine and all the other issues. Souedi, what message do you have for future generations? Habash. On the basis of what life has taught me, taking the bitter and the sweet together, I am convinced that human history moves in a progressive direction. I say this confidently and hopefully, in spite of all the failures and defeats we have suffered. Despite the bitter struggle between the forces of progress and those of darkness, specifically in the Arab region, I predict that the future belongs to our nation. But hopes, wishes, and dreams alone will not achieve our objectives or bring victory. One cannot roll back the wheel of history, but we can make sure that the lessons of the past are not dissipated or squandered in a fit of emotional, destructive, and unhealthy rejection of history. History is a register open to whoever has the determination and ability to merit an entry therein and the staying power to continue to grace its bright and leading pages. I am full of hope that the generations of our children and our grandchildren will have a future that is brighter than our present. I derive immense satisfaction from this thought. George Habash, the future of the Palestinian National Movement. Dr. George Habash, the General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, was interviewed by the Journal in Damascus on May 14, 1985. The interview is one in a series of JPS interviews with leading figures in the Palestinian National Movement. JPS, following its departure from Beirut in 1982, the PLO split into two currents. One is described by observers as moderate, is led by Yasser Arafat and seeks a political settlement in coordination with Jordan and Syria. The other is described as radical, enjoys Syrian support and seeks to revive the policy of armed resistance. Do you agree with this analysis? How do you assess the potential of both currents given prevailing Palestinian, Arab, and international conditions? Habash, before answering, I would like to point out an important issue overlooked by the question, namely, that these two major currents on the Palestinian scene do not date from the period following the departure from Beirut in 1982 but, rather, have been in existence for many years. This division, or distinction, is as old as the Palestinian Revolution. Since the earliest days of post-1948 Palestinian national action, there has been a conflict between the movement's two main wings, the rightist wing, representing national bourgeois policy in the revolution, and the leftist wing, representing the policy of the working and popular classes. Please note the interview was conducted before the recent fighting for control of Sabra, Shatila, and Burj al-Barajana erupted. Distinction may be observed at most, if not all, the major milestones in the history of the revolution and the PLO. It is true that this distinction did not reach the point of division or a final break, as is now the case, but it is also true that the current state of the Palestinian revolution is a logical and natural result of these past distinctions which, and this is most important, reflect the division and contrasts among the various social and class forces that constitute the Palestine National Liberation Movement. Here too I should add that the relationship between these two currents has passed through periods of tension and periods of détente depending on the circumstances and the events we faced. The central issue, however, is that despite of everything, the Palestinian revolution maintained its internal unity in the face of the dangers which threatened it, especially in the face of the Zionist onslaught on Beirut which sought to liquidate the revolution in its entirety. The point to be emphasized is that before Beirut, our differences with the Palestinian right took place against a national background. Unity and struggle were practiced within the same national framework. The new factor after Beirut, however, is that the dominant rightist current in the PLO began to show its readiness to adapt itself to American conditions. This became clear in its wishy-washy approach to the Reagan Initiative. In addition, there was an opening up to the Egyptian regime, and close ties were forged with the Jordanian regime. This began to threaten the militant national identity of the PLO and signaled the readiness of this current to abandon both the exclusivity of Palestinian representation within the framework of the PLO and the essence of the PLO's national covenant, which calls for return, self-determination and the creation of an independent state. This somewhat lengthy introduction is meant to make clear certain facts which some information agencies have tried to cover up in an attempt to portray the Palestinian conflict as temporary and the result of regional factors whose effect and influence on Palestinian decision-making began to grow following the departure from Beirut. While acknowledging the role and influence of these factors, we cannot ignore the core of the problem which, as already noted, lies in the departure of certain segments and groups within the PLO from the course of the Palestine National Liberation Movement and their adoption of a policy of concession and surrender which will place them in the enemy camp. The policy is dictated by several factors, the most important being their bourgeois and conciliatory class nature and their collision with a number of obstacles and setbacks which usually drive such forces to retreat. The problem cannot be reduced to the dimensions of a moderate current seeking a political settlement in coordination with Jordan and Egypt and a radical current supported by Syria. This problem also has deeper dimensions on the Arab and international levels. As for ourselves, we are part of a national, progressive, democratic Arab alliance which includes all the organizations and regimes of the Arab liberation movement. The deviationist leadership, on the other hand, maintains close and firm ties with the Arab reactionary camp, with all its regimes and forces, and is now moving to become a constituent part of it. On the international level, the process of calculation is also different. They are betting on the USA and have high hopes of gaining its recognition. We, on the other hand, consider ourselves part of the current of revolutionary forces in the world headed by our friend, the Soviet Union. As for the outlook for the two currents in the present circumstances, on the Palestinian, Arab, and international levels, I would like to emphasize that the policy of deviation will run into a brick wall sooner or later. The proponents of this policy will gain nothing from all their attempts to appear moderate. The end of this particular road is quite clear to us. It means sacrificing all our principles for nothing in return. Indeed, the logical result of such a policy will simply be to whittle away the gains achieved by our people and our revolution, as is happening now. If we need to give examples to support the accuracy of our forecasts, we can point to the substance of the Amman Accord, which grants Jordan something which we ourselves wrested from it through a decade of bitter struggle and sacrifice until we obtained the Rabat resolutions. Now current events seem to point to a turning back of the clock and to Jordan's regaining the initiative. On the Egyptian front also, the leaders of this current believed they could benefit from Egypt's importance in two ways, first by applying pressure on Washington and Tel Aviv, and second by applying pressure on Jordan, which seeks to reclaim the Palestinian card. What was the result? The result of the establishment of formal relations between Egypt and the PLO is that ties between Cairo and Tel Aviv have become closer than at any time in the past. The closer the Palestinian right and some Arab reactionary regimes draw to Cairo, the closer Cairo draws to Tel Aviv. On the other hand, instead of the weight of Arab influence being on the side of the PLO in its relations with Jordan, King Hussein has been able to strengthen his alliance with Hosni Mubarak. The PLO is now subjected to the combined pressure of Jordan and Egypt, which seeks to deprive it of its remaining cards, as demonstrated by the Mubarak initiative which went beyond King Hussein's own well-known initiative. Therefore, it is clear that the option chosen by the rightist leadership will lead only to forcing the PLO into more crises and dead ends. These leaders will not succeed in reaching a political accord guaranteeing even the minimum legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. As for the other current inside the Palestinian revolution, one ought to examine its activity and development. Despite the difficulties facing its struggle, This current has open horizons and is seeking to acquire enough strength to enable it to continue the revolution until the national objectives and aspirations of our people are achieved. On the Palestinian level, there has been a mass departure from the rightist current following the signing of the Amman Accord. There is also broad national and trade union opposition to this accord and a substantial rallying around the forces opposed to it. On the Arab level, despite the difficulties which the Arab liberation movement currently faces, one can see signs of revival in that movement, what we might call early signs of the coming of revolutionary change in the Arab homeland. These signs have become clearer in Lebanon through the victories of the Lebanese National Resistance Front, in the Sudan and in the bread unrest throughout North Africa. On the international level, the depth of the progressive current on the Palestinian scene reaches the heart of the socialist camp, led by the Soviet Union, as well as the national liberation movements throughout the world. This international front, with whom the rightist current has neglected to make alliance, cannot but support the national rights of the Palestinian people and its ongoing revolution. In short, we rely on the historic and strategic alliances of the revolution, whereas the other party seeks new alliances in the enemy camp. Their only concern is to deprive the PLO of all its cards in preparation for its absorption by the Jordanian regime and its transformation into a reactionary caricature in the service of U.S. objectives. The fate of these two currents is clear and cannot be obscured by present entanglements or problems. JPS, do you believe there is room for reconciliation between the two broad currents on the Palestinian scene, and on what foundations? Habash, based on my answer above, I believe that the rightist current, misnamed the moderate current, will not abandon its political option until the very end. This current is a captive of its class affiliations and present alliances and shows no signs of backing away, especially since this option has become the basis of personal gambles which cannot easily be abandoned if the present leadership remains. Furthermore, in view of the problems created by the policy of the deviationist leadership inside the PLO, we cannot accept the continued domination of the rightist current and the influence of its symbols after all the pain and suffering it has caused our people and revolution, even if we assume that they might abandon the Amman Accord under the pressure of the crisis they face today. This is why we have called for linking the struggle to abrogate the Amman Accord with the struggle to abrogate the policy and the symbols produced by that accord. It is on this basis that the Palestine National Salvation Front was proclaimed. What should be emphasized in this context is that the more the deviationist leadership becomes embroiled in U.S. schemes, the more our masses and their national forces will abandon it. We are confident that this leadership will leave the ranks of the PLO isolated and divested of all popular backing or support. We, in turn, are presently engaged in speeding up the process of mass and national disillusionment with this leadership. This leads us to another essential point, namely, that the remote chance of a meeting between the two currents does not, and should not, in any sense mean that chances of achieving Palestinian national unity in the face of imperialist designs are also remote. This unity will one day be achieved. It will include the broadest sectors of our people, and will exclude only those who bargained away our national rights and the gains of our people and our revolution. JPS, do you in the Salvation Front consider yourselves a substitute for the PLO? How do you conceive of rebuilding the institutions and the role of the PLO? Habash, we in the Palestine National Salvation Front do not consider ourselves as substitute for the PLO. We have emphasized this fact more than once, as we did in the documents which established the Salvation Front itself. In this respect, we proceed from a firm belief in the necessity of the return of the PLO to its national line so that it can remain a framework uniting the Palestinian people and acting as its sole legitimate representative. Contrary to the propaganda and information campaign waged against us by rightist and reactionary elements, we are the ones who are most attached to this major accomplishment of the Palestinian people, and we shall resist all attempts to abandon it or to present it on a silver platter to reactionary circles, as has been done by the rightist leadership. This leadership violated the principle of the unity of Palestinian representation within the framework of the PLO when it signed the Amman Accord and accepted Jordanian participation in such representation. Our concern is reflected in the documents of the Salvation Front, which are designed to be a temporary framework to restore the PLO to its national line. We have affirmed in several instances our adherence to the PLO and to safeguarding its national line. Our rejection of any substitute or parallel formulas has often been stressed. As for the second part of the question, we believe that a battle must now be waged to isolate the deviationist right in order to prepare to restore the PLO to its national line. This requires the widest possible mobilization of national forces opposed to the policy of deviation and its symbols so that it may be possible to speak of rebuilding the institutions of the PLO on national and democratic foundations. We are not about to create a new role for the PLO. When we speak of restoring it to the national line, we mean restoring it to its national role as outlined by the resolutions of its national and legitimate councils, the last of which was held in Algeria. This is a role which derives from the PLO's identity as a national liberation movement opposed to imperialism, Zionism, and reaction. Then again, we do not intend to create new institutions for the PLO. We are simply working to rebuild existing institutions, such as the Executive Committee, the Central Council and the National Council, on democratic foundations which guarantee collective leadership, reject hegemony, and grant an active and influential role to the Palestinian democratic and progressive forces. In other words, we shall work to implement the organizational programs approved by the PLO in successive national councils. Their implementation has been obstructed by the domination of the deviationist leadership and their monopoly on the decision-making process. JPS, how do you conceive of the strategy of Palestinian action in the coming stage? Habash, the strategy of Palestinian action in the coming stage revolves around a central axis, the adoption of a policy of armed struggle and the escalation of that struggle against the Zionist enemy. We are still living in a stage characterized by a clear imbalance of power to the advantage of the enemy. This means, a priori, that it is impossible to wrest even a minimum of legitimate Palestinian national rights, let alone achieve the implementation of a stage-by-stage strategic program for Palestinian national struggle. Therefore, until it is possible to say that we are capable of achieving these rights, escalating armed struggle against the Zionist enemy is required until the enemy is forced to retreat, as happened in Lebanon. Armed struggle, as we understand it and in accordance with our conception of a people's war, is the most developed form of struggle waged by revolutionary forces. It implies the total support of the masses which have been mobilized, organized, and trained. Every citizen has the opportunity to resist occupation by all available means. Theories of armed struggle have been put to the test more than once and their scientific character has been demonstrated. The experience of the heroic resistance in Beirut in 1982 constitutes proof of this. The Lebanese example has been, and will remain, an example for us all. Defined in this manner and as clarified by experience, armed struggle is closely linked with all other forms of struggle: diplomatic, popular, intellectual, and political. Although it is the highest form of all, and the most effective against the enemy, it is closely linked in a complementary manner with the other forms such that no single type of struggle can be ignored. On the other hand, escalation of Palestinian popular struggle should be linked to and complemented by its Arab dimension through strengthening coordination and alliances with groups inside the Arab liberation movement and with patriotic Arab regimes. The struggle against the enemy has never been just a Palestinian Zionist conflict, despite the importance and centrality of the Palestinian factor. It is, rather, an Arab Zionist conflict, which calls for the mobilization of all the resources of the Arab nation. This is why we have always attached great importance in Palestinian national action to the question of alliances with the Arab liberation movement, in all its forms. In this context, the Lebanese arena occupies a unique place in Palestinian strategy. The struggle with the Zionist enemy in Lebanon is open and clear. We still have a military presence to fight enemy and to protect the security of our camps in the face of Zionist attacks. I am not revealing secrets when I say that we in the Palestinian Revolution are incomparably better off today on the Lebanese scene than we were a year ago or more. We are in the process of developing our role in full coordination with the Lebanese national forces and with Syria, so that Palestinians can have sufficient room for maneuvering without being provoked on the one hand, and without returning to the pre-1982 situation on the other. Furthermore, the Jordanian arena, with its particular geographical and demographic characteristics relative to the Palestinian presence, has special importance within this strategy. We base our analysis on the necessity of creating a base of support for the Palestinian revolution in one of the countries adjacent to occupied Palestine. We accord Jordan top priority in this respect. In addition, as we formulate a strategy for Palestinian action in the coming stage, we cannot but think of a close alliance with Syria, which plays a central role in countering U.S. designs in the area and in blocking its way, whether in Lebanon or in the Arab world in general. On the international level, we have a set policy, the essence of which is to maintain a close strategic relationship with the socialist bloc countries led by the Soviet Union, with liberation movements and with communist, democratic and progressive parties throughout the world. Our alliances on the Palestinian, Arab, and international levels are what will ensure the desired transformation in the balance of power in the coming stage. Our people will thereby be able to regain their national rights, foremost among them the right of return, self-determination and the establishment of an independent state. JPS, do you believe that there is a link between this strategy and the Syrian strategy? How is this translated into practice? Habash, there is, no doubt, a special link between the Palestinian and Syrian strategies, which grows out of a common struggle against the enemy. All the following activities constitute examples of the many points which link Syrian and Palestinian strategy: our political activity in challenging the Camp David conspiracy, the battles we waged jointly in Lebanon which culminated in the abrogation of the May 17 Accord and the expulsion of the NATO and Zionist presence and from most Lebanese territory, and our success along with the Lebanese nationalists, who played the principal role, in undermining the fascist hegemony and in driving it back inside the borders of its isolationist ghetto. We find in Syria today a principal base for the struggle at this stage. With its capabilities, Syria plays the chief role in maintaining Arab steadfastness and in challenging efforts to defeat it. This, of course, does not mean that the two strategies are identical. There is a difference between a strategy of a people's war adopted by Palestinian action and the Syrian strategy, which is based on the strategic balance and conventional war. This difference, however, does not diminish the reciprocal benefit offered by the two strategies and leaves the door open for more advanced forms of coordination and cooperation. JPS, how do you view the role of the Palestinian people inside the occupied territories within the framework of the strategy of Palestinian action? Do you think the model of national resistance in South Lebanon can be applied inside Palestine? Habash, the Palestinian people inside the occupied territories occupy a central position in the strategy of Palestinian action. Suffice it to say that almost half the Palestinian people still reside in their homeland. Hence the importance and centrality of their role. The Zionist enemy has succeeded in using the weapon of land sequestration, but has not until now, despite its terrorist policies, its many massacres and its acts of brutality, succeeded in uprooting that part of our people from its national soil. It may be said that the fact that our people have remained on our national soil constitutes the most effective weapon we possess to combat the policy of creeping dispossession of the land. Furthermore, our masses in the occupied homeland have played a prominent role in frustrating attempts to create a substitute for the PLO. It has become impossible for the enemy to find anyone with any mass following willing to negotiate with them or speak in place of the PLO. These facts emphasize that all national Palestinian forces and organizations should give the territories the attention they deserve. The facts ALS demonstrate the necessity of speeding up the crystallization of a program of action on the popular and leadership levels in the occupied territories. It must also be pointed out that our concentration the occupied territories as the central arena of our struggle should not for one moment lead us to ignore or underestimate the importance of Palestinian action in the diaspora, nor should it make us ignore or underestimate the importance of the role played by the structure of the Palestinian revolution abroad. The modem experience of the Palestinian struggle has revealed that the existence of the PLO has played a central role in awakening the masses in the occupied homeland. These masses now have a focal point which unifies their struggle, speaks in their name and expresses their national interests. At every stage when the PLO achieved certain gains or suffered setbacks, these were directly reflected in the occupied homeland. Demonstrations would erupt in each town and village to everyone's surprise, including the PLO leaders themselves. As for the second part of the question, we believe that the model of Lebanese national resistance is an inspiration for our people's struggle and will directly affect the situation in the occupied homeland. For the first time, a people's war, with all its ramifications, was waged against the enemy, which found itself, also for the first time, forced to retreat unconditionally from a land it had occupied and on which it remained at a very high human and material cost. These central facts should not drive us in the direction of an unreasonable optimism regarding applicability of the Lebanese model to the occupied homeland for the following reasons. 1. The occupied Palestinian territories lack the geographical and demographic depth of the occupied Lebanese south. The result is a scarcity of military support and facilities. Moreover, the occupied Lebanese south found in the liberated national territories and in Syria sources of support, whereas the Jordanian regime, for example, stands as an obstacle to the delivery of such support to the occupied Palestinian territories. 2. There is a difference in the conditions of occupation in Palestinian and Lebanese territories. The occupation of the first came after a period of hegemony by the Jordanian regime when public freedoms were suppressed and all attempts at armed action against the Zionist enemy, indeed the mere possession of arms itself, were forbidden. The occupation of the south, on the other hand, came after almost a decade of civil war. Arms were abundant and there were experienced fighters in every town and village in Lebanon. This made it possible to join in the fighting at a rate not possible in our own occupied lands. 3. Zionist objectives in occupied Palestinian land are different from the objectives in Lebanon. Broad political groups inside Israel believe Palestinian land to be part of the Promised Land, not to be relinquished under any circumstances. Thus, the repetition of the Lebanese model on Palestinian soil requires arduous struggle to bring about a transformation in the objective conditions. This is why Jordan occupies an important place in our strategy for the coming phase. The difficulties involved in applying the Lebanese model do not in any way lessen the value of the Lebanese example and its many positive effects among Palestinians in general and in the occupied homeland in particular. JPS, Israel is proceeding to tighten its hold on Palestinian territories occupied in 1967 while the Palestinians are witnessing a paralyzing split. The Arab arena is also plagued by differences which impede the adoption of a unified Arab position. What do you see as the direct response to Israeli measures aimed at leaving little or nothing for future negotiation? Habash, the situation on both the Palestinian and Arab levels clearly enables the enemy to adopt wide-ranging measures in the occupied lands so that day by day the area of Arab land awaiting absorption or expropriation is shrinking. Zionist activity has gone far along the path of land expropriation, even if on the level of actually settling people the success has not been as great. Colonization, as you know, is a weapon in the hands of the Zionist leadership which it uses against us to exploit both the occupation of Arab lands and the present condition of the Arab world. From our point of view, we have no alternative but resistance of all possible kinds. Hence, the importance of that segment of our people still residing in the homeland. Israel wants to expropriate the land, but our people continue to live in and to be attached to their homeland. The future belongs to them, and this is what scares the enemy, despite the expropriation of land. Shimon Peres, for instance, expresses the fear that by the year 2000, Palestinian numbers will equal those of the Israelis. This is why he is seeking a regional compromise solution with Jordan through the so-called Jordanian option. Therefore, we must escalate our military operations in these territories so that life becomes exceedingly difficult for the Israelis and more costly than comfortable for their colonialist enterprises. Just because Israel annexes this or that territory does not mean that we should abandon our demand for it. Otherwise, How can we call for the recovery of the Golan and Jerusalem? More importantly, what meaning would our slogan of liberating Palestine and creating a democratic republic on our national soil have? We realize that these Zionist measures add new burdens, and we know quite well that the enemy wants to create new facts on the ground to make it impossible to demand the abrogation or transcending of these facts. But our only option is constant resistance to restore the balance of power, so that not only will these measures be negated, but so that we may go even further in achieving our interim and strategic objectives. Of course, this does not mean that we underestimate the gravity of these measures. They are of the utmost harm to our masses in the occupied land, as they place new difficulties in the way of solving our national problem. This requires widely based resistance and close attention to developing forms and methods of common action in the occupied homeland, in addition to escalating our armed struggle.